What do we ask for when there is very little left to ask for? Not bicycles, not toys, not the future. At a certain age, wishes grow quieter. They stop shouting and start whispering. They ask not for more time, but for meaning. Henry Walker had delivered mail for 43 years. Rain, heat, snow, grief, joy, all of it folded into leather satchels and front porch steps. At 67, his knees ached before dawn, and his hands smelled permanently of paper and ink. He still woke up before the alarm, out of habit more than need. Before we continue, if you love stories that warm your heart and awaken emotions that help you to become a better person, be sure to subscribe to this channel and show your love by liking the video. If you enjoy it, share a story with us, one that filled your heart with joy and emotion. It might inspire our next video. Every morning began the same way. Coffee gone cold on the counter, boots laced slowly, a brief look at the framed photo of his late wife Margaret, smiling at a beach neither of them ever returned to. He touched the frame once, every day, before leaving. "Be careful," he whispered, though he didn't know who he was saying it to anymore. The neighborhood on Maple Street was quiet in December. Lawns bare, windows fogged, decorations modest. But one house never changed, a pale blue two-story home with peeling paint and a sagging porch. No wreath, no lights, just silence and letters. It started with one, then two, then a stack so thick it bent the rubber band holding it together, all addressed to the same place, Santa Claus, North Pole. Henry frowned, shifting the bundle in his hands. Undeliverable, no stamp, no return name, only the address of the blue house written again and again in different handwritings. Some shaky, some careful, some barely legible. He flipped one over, another and another. "Now that's strange," he murmured. Over the following week more appeared, dozens, then hundreds. Each day the stack grew heavier, not just in weight, but in feeling. Henry began setting them aside, unable to bring himself to toss them into the bin reserved for forgotten mail. One morning, curiosity overcame routine. He sat in his truck, heater humming, and carefully opened one letter. Inside, the handwriting trembled. "Dear Santa, I don't need anything new. I just want someone to remember my name this Christmas." Henry's breath caught. He didn't finish his route on time that day. He couldn't, because for the first time in decades, Henry Walker realized something deeply unsettling. These letters were not written by children. They were written by people who had already lived most of their lives and were still waiting to be seen. And without knowing it, Henry had just stepped into a story that would change his final winter forever. Henry parked his mail truck across the street from the blue house and turned off the engine. The sudden quiet felt heavier than the hum of the motor. Snow rested along the porch steps, untouched, as if no one had gone in or out for days, maybe longer. He checked the address again. Same as always, Maple Street, number 114. In 43 years of delivering mail, Henry had never seen anyone come to the door. He sat there for a moment, staring at the stack of letters on the passenger seat. Different handwriting, different ink, same destination, same hope folded into thin paper. Finally, he stepped out into the cold. The porch creaked under his weight as he climbed the steps. He knocked once, then again. The sound echoed hollowly, like it had nowhere to land. No answer. Henry tried the doorbell. Nothing. He should have walked away. Regulations were clear. Undeliverable mail stayed undeliverable. Curiosity had no place on a route. But something in him, something old and tired and human, refused to leave. He leaned closer to the door. From inside came a faint sound, a radio, an old one, static-laced music drifting through the wood, a Christmas song from another decade. Henry exhaled slowly. "Someone's home," he whispered. He knocked again, softer this time. After a long pause, the door opened just a crack. A woman's eye appeared, pale blue, cautious, tired. "Yes?" she asked. Her voice was thin, like it hadn't been used much. "I'm Henry," he said quickly, lowering his hand so she wouldn't feel threatened. "Mailman. I've been delivering to this street for years." The door opened a little wider. The woman was elderly. White hair pulled back loosely, a cardigan buttoned wrong at the middle. She smelled faintly of lavender and something medicinal. "I'm Eleanor," she said. "Is something wrong?" Henry swallowed. I've been seeing a lot of letters addressed to Santa from this house." Eleanor's shoulders sagged, not in surprise, in recognition. "Oh," she said quietly. "Those." She opened the door fully now. Warm air spilled out, carrying the scent of soup and old furniture. Behind her, Henry glimpsed a living room filled with mismatched chairs. Several elderly figures sat quietly, one near the window, one asleep, another staring at a small artificial tree with only 3 ornaments. "They write them every year," Eleanor said, stepping aside. "Would you like to come in? It's cold." Henry hesitated, then stepped across the threshold. The house was not empty. It was full of age, full of waiting. "These are my residents," Eleanor said softly. "This used to be a family home. When the funding ran out for the care center, we brought them here. It's all we had." An old man looked up from his chair. "Are you Santa?" he asked, hopeful and half smiling. Henry's chest tightened. "No," he said gently, "just the mailman." The man nodded. "That's all right. Mailmen bring things too." Henry looked around the room again, at the thin blankets, the quiet faces, the silence heavy with unsent words. And suddenly, the letters made sense. They were not asking for gifts. They were asking not to disappear. Henry Walker stood there, surrounded by strangers who felt achingly familiar, and understood one simple truth. Ignoring those letters would be the easiest thing he'd ever done, and the most unforgivable. Henry sat at his kitchen table long after sunset, the house quiet except for the ticking clock on the wall. The letters were spread before him like fallen leaves. He had brought them home, something he had never done before in all his years as a mailman. One by one he opened them. The handwriting varied. Some letters were written carefully, as if the writer had all the time in the world. Others shook across the page, the ink fading in places where hands had grown tired. "Dear Santa, I don't need presents. I just want to hear a song I remember from when my wife was still alive." Henry closed his eyes. Another letter. "Dear Santa, if you're listening, please tell my daughter I never stopped loving her." I didn't know how to say it back then. His throat tightened. He poured himself a cup of coffee he didn't drink. Each letter carried the same quiet truth. These were not wishes for things. They were wishes for connection, for forgiveness, for someone, somewhere, to know they had existed. Henry thought of Margaret, of the arguments that never quite ended right, of the apologies that arrived too late. He pressed his fingers against the table and whispered, "We all think we have more time." The radio on the counter crackled to life, playing a familiar Christmas tune. It was the same song he and Margaret used to hum while decorating a tree that never seemed to stand straight. The sound stirred something loose in his chest. By midnight, Henry had read dozens of letters. One name appeared again and again at the bottom of several pages. Frank. Another set was signed Lillian, and another, written in a firm but fading script, ended with George, age 91. They were not anonymous after all. They were waiting to be known. The next morning, Henry carried the letters with him, not in his mailbag but under his arm, like something fragile. He drove to Susan's house before starting his route. Susan opened the door in her robe, hair pulled back, concern immediately on her face. "Dad, is everything okay?" He held up the stack. "I need your help," he said, "and I need it now." She invited him in, and as she read the letters, her eyes filled. "These people," she whispered, "they're asking for dignity." Henry nodded. "And I don't know how to deliver that alone." Susan looked at him with a mixture of admiration and resolve. "Then we won't do it alone." For the first time in years, Henry felt something shift, not urgency, purpose. The next afternoon, Henry returned to the Blue House, this time without letters in his hands, but with intention in his chest. Eleanor answered the door again. She seemed unsurprised to see him. "I was hoping you'd come back," she said softly. Inside, the same residents sat in their places. The same radio hummed. But something had changed, or maybe Henry was seeing it differently now. He greeted them by name. "Good afternoon, Frank." "Hello, Lillian." "George." Their faces lifted in small, startled ways, as if being named reminded them they were still here. "I read your letters," Henry said gently, standing in the center of the room. "All of them." There was no shame in their expressions, only quiet acceptance. "We didn't expect answers," Eleanor said. "They write them every year. It helps them sleep." Frank cleared his throat. "Santa never wrote back," he said with a soft smile. Henry swallowed. "No, but someone else might." That evening, Susan arrived with boxes of stationery, envelopes and pens that were easy to grip. She knelt beside wheelchairs, sat at low tables, listened more than she spoke. "Tell me who you want to write to," she said kindly. One by one, hands reached out. "My brother," Lillian said. "My daughter," Frank whispered. "My old friend from the Navy," George added. Some didn't know addresses. Some didn't know if the people were still alive. "That's all right," Susan said. "We'll try." Henry watched from the doorway, heart heavy and full at the same time. Over the next days, letters went out, not to the North Pole, but to real homes, real people, real pasts. The post office hummed with unusual purpose as Henry personally stamped each envelope. The town began to notice. A librarian offered to help find lost addresses. A church choir volunteered to sing at the house. A baker dropped off bread without saying a word. And on one quiet afternoon, as snow fell gently outside, Eleanor took Henry aside. "You know," she said, "they've started waiting by the window again." Henry frowned. "Waiting for what?" "For the mail," she said. "Not because they expect something, but because hope came back." Henry looked at the window, at the fragile silhouettes sitting straighter in their chairs. He nodded slowly. A promise had been made, not loudly, not publicly, but deeply. And somewhere between paper and ink, memory and regret, something miraculous was already beginning. The first reply arrived on a Wednesday morning. Henry noticed it immediately. A cream-colored envelope, handwritten, careful. It stood out among utility bills and advertisements like a candle in the dark. The return address was unfamiliar, but the name on the front made his breath pause. For Frank Miller. Henry stared at it for a long moment before sliding it gently into his bag. He delivered the rest of the route slower than usual, heart tapping against his ribs. When he reached the Blue House, Eleanor was already waiting by the door. "They've been restless today," she said quietly, "like they feel something coming." Henry stepped inside and held up the envelope. "This came today," he said. Frank was sitting by the window, hands folded on his lap. When he saw the letter, his eyes widened, not with excitement but disbelief. "That's not funny," Frank said softly. "Someone shouldn't play games like that." "No games," Henry replied. "I promise." Frank's hands shook as he took the envelope. He stared at it as if it might vanish. The room went still. Even the radio seemed to quiet. He opened it slowly, Inside was a single page, folded once. "Dad, I didn't know if this letter would ever reach you. I didn't know if you were still alive, but I never stopped wondering." Frank's shoulders began to tremble. "I was young, angry, proud. I told myself I didn't need you, but I was wrong." The letter slipped from his fingers. Tears traced lines down his weathered face, not loud, not dramatic, but full and heavy. "She remembers," he whispered. "She remembers." Eleanor knelt beside him. Lillian reached for his hand. George nodded slowly, as if witnessing something sacred. Henry stood frozen near the doorway, throat burning. That night, the house felt different. Voices lingered longer. Laughter returned in brief, surprising bursts. Someone asked for a song on the radio. Someone else asked for seconds at dinner. Hope, once fragile, had taken its first breath. After the first reply, the waiting changed. It was no longer silent. Each morning, residents dressed a little earlier. Hair was combed with more care. Chairs were angled toward the window. The sound of the mail truck became a signal, not just noise. Henry felt it every day. Some letters brought joy, others brought grief. Not every message was answered with warmth. One letter returned unopened, another carried news of a death long past, but even those were received with quiet dignity. "At least now I know," Lillian said once, folding a letter carefully. Not knowing was heavier. One afternoon, a letter arrived addressed to George Thompson. George stared at it for a long time before opening it. Inside was a photograph. Two young men in navy uniforms, arms slung over each other's shoulders, smiling wide and fearless. "I thought he forgot me," George said, voice thick. "I thought the war took that part of him." The letter was short. "You saved my life. I never forgot. I just didn't know how to find you." George pressed the photograph to his chest. Across the room, Eleanor wiped her eyes quietly. Henry watched it all, the healing and the ache, and felt something stirring inside him, something unfinished. That night, he stood in his kitchen, staring at a blank envelope. His hands hovered, uncertain. Susan watched from the doorway. "You've been quiet," she said. He nodded. "I've been reading everyone else's past." "And yours?" she asked gently. Henry looked down. "I never wrote to my brother after Margaret died. We stopped speaking years ago. Pride, I suppose." Susan placed a pen in his hand. "Then maybe it's time." Henry sat. He wrote slowly. "I don't know how to start, but I miss you." When he sealed the envelope, his chest felt lighter and terrified. The next morning, he slipped it into the outgoing mail. And for the first time, Henry understood something deeply personal. Delivering hope to others had opened a door he had kept closed for years. Christmas was approaching. And the greatest miracle, he realized, might still be on its way. The days before Christmas carried a different kind of silence. It was not empty anymore. It was full of expectation. The residents of the Blue House waited by the window each morning, coats folded on their laps, eyes following the street as if hope itself might turn the corner. The sound of Henry's truck had become a heartbeat, steady, familiar, reassuring. But not every wait was rewarded. Some days, Henry walked in with nothing but ordinary mail. No envelopes with careful handwriting, no news from the past. Those were the hardest days. Frank tried to hide his disappointment by turning up the radio. Lillian busied herself folding napkins that did not need folding. George stared at the floor, the photograph tucked safely in his pocket. "It's all right," Eleanor would say gently. "Some answers take time." Henry nodded, though the weight of their waiting pressed against his chest. One afternoon, snow fell thick and fast, muting the world outside. Henry arrived later than usual, boots soaked, breath short. Eleanor met him at the door with a worried look. "Is everything okay?" she asked. He forced a smile. "Just the weather." Inside, the residents looked up all at once. "Anything today?" George asked quietly. Henry hesitated, then shook his head. The disappointment was brief but deep, like a wave that pulled back quickly, leaving silence behind. That evening, Henry sat alone in his truck long after his shift ended. He thought of the letter he had sent to his brother, no reply yet. Each day without an answer echoed louder. He wondered if hope could become cruel when it lingered too long. At home, he stood before Margaret's photograph again. "What if I opened something I can't fix?" he whispered. The radio answered with a soft Christmas carol, familiar, gentle. The next morning, Christmas Eve, Henry awoke before dawn. His hands trembled slightly as he dressed. The route felt heavier than usual, as if the entire town were holding its breath. When he reached the post office, a large bundle waited in his bin. Handwritten envelopes, different names, same address. Henry stared. He counted them once. Then again, 27 letters. His breath left him in a long, shaky exhale. "Looks like Santa showed up late," a co-worker joked. Henry said nothing. He gathered the letters carefully, as if carrying something alive. For the first time in days, hope didn't feel fragile. It felt ready. The blue house glowed that evening. Candles flickered on every surface. The smell of soup and fresh bread filled the air. A small tree stood in the corner, its branches decorated with paper stars and handwritten names. Henry arrived just before sunset, letters tucked inside his coat. When Eleanor opened the door and saw his face, she knew. "They came," she whispered. He nodded. The residents gathered slowly, carefully, as if afraid sudden movement might break the moment. Chairs were pulled closer together. Hands reached out for warmth, for reassurance. Henry stood in the center of the room. "These are for you," he said quietly. "All of you." One by one he handed them out. Frank received 2 letters. Lillian received one thick envelope tied with string. George received a card, its edges worn as if it had traveled far. There were tears, soft laughter, hands pressed to mouths, names spoken aloud, names that had not been spoken in decades. Eleanor moved through the room, placing gentle hands on shoulders, offering tissues, offering silence where words were too heavy. At the end, one envelope remained. Henry stared at it. Susan, standing near the doorway, noticed. "Dad?" she asked softly. The name on the front was his own. Henry's hands shook as he opened it. "I didn't know how to answer you," the letter read. "But I'm glad you wrote. I've missed you too." The room seemed to fade around him. Susan stepped closer. "Is it him?" Henry nodded, tears finally falling. Outside, church bells rang in the distance, marking Christmas Eve. Inside the blue house, something extraordinary happened. Not loudly, not perfectly, but completely. The letters were read, stories were shared, old songs were sung, voices thin but sincere. For one night the past loosened its grip, and as snow fell softly outside, the residents of the blue house, and one mailman who had nearly reached the end of his road, discovered that miracles do not arrive wrapped in noise. They arrive quietly, on paper, with someone willing to deliver them. Christmas morning arrived without ceremony, no crowds, no rush, just light. Soft winter sunlight slipped through the curtains of the blue house, settling gently on the faces of those still half asleep in their chairs. The night had been long, full of stories, letters read aloud, and memories that refused to stay buried. Eleanor moved quietly through the house, careful not to disturb anyone. The radio played low, a familiar melody drifting through the rooms like a shared breath. Henry sat at the kitchen table, with a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. He had slept little, but his exhaustion felt earned, peaceful. Across from him, Frank stared out the window. "I forgot what it felt like," Frank said after a while. Henry looked up. "What's that?" To wake up without dread, Frank replied. To wake up, expecting something good. Lillian shuffled into the room, cardigan wrapped tight around her shoulders. I dreamed of my sister, she said softly. She was young again. She smiled at me. George joined them last, moving slowly but standing a little straighter than before. I wrote back, he said. First thing this morning. Eleanor smiled. So did half the house. Letters lay stacked on the table, responses, thank yous, new beginnings written in careful ink. Henry's phone buzzed. He stared at it for a long moment before answering. Hello? Henry, came a familiar voice. Older, worn, real. It's your brother. Henry closed his eyes. They spoke briefly, carefully. Not about the past, not yet, but about weather, about time, about maybe seeing each other soon. When the call ended, Henry rested his forehead in his hands. Susan squeezed his shoulder. Proud of you, she whispered. Outside, a few neighbors stopped by with food. A child dropped off a card. Someone shoveled the walkway without being asked. The blue house was no longer invisible. It had become a place of arrival. And for the first time in many years, the people inside it felt like they belonged not to the past, but to the present. The letters never stopped. They slowed, perhaps, but they did not end. And neither did the visits. By New Year's Day, the Blue House had a rhythm. Music nights, shared meals, afternoons filled with conversation instead of silence. Henry returned to his route with lighter steps. He was retiring in the spring, but for the first time, the thought didn't frighten him. He knew now that endings were often disguised beginnings. One afternoon, he stood once more on the porch of the Blue House, mail satchel resting at his side. Eleanor joined him, wrapping a scarf around her neck. You change things, she said. Henry shook his head. They changed me. Inside, Frank laughed at something George had said. Lillian hummed to the radio. Life moved gently forward. On Henry's final delivery before Christmas decorations came down, he carried one last envelope addressed not to Santa, but to the house itself. Inside was a note signed by many hands. Thank you for delivering our voices when we thought no one could hear them. Henry folded the note carefully and placed it in his coat pocket. As he walked back to his truck, snow began to fall, light, unhurried. He thought of all the letters he had carried over the years. Bills, notices, announcements, endings. But these letters had been different. They had asked for nothing except to be remembered, and in answering them, Henry had learned something simple and lasting. Time does not erase us. Silence does. As long as someone is willing to listen, to write, to read, to deliver, no life is ever truly forgotten. And that, Henry realized, was the true Christmas miracle. Not the one we wait for, but the one we choose to carry forward.